Happy Saturday, everyone. I'm the dramatic historian, and today we are here with historian, professor, and my former advisor, Dr. Steven Woodworth. He serves as a professor at Texas Christian University as well as Liberty University. He is the winner of the Society of Military History Distinguished Book Award and has authored, edited, and co-edited 34 books. And today we're lucky enough to have him on to discuss one of his most recent publications, And Rest Under the Shade of Trees, Essays in Honor of Robertson, James Robertson Jr. So let's get into it. Thank you so much for coming on, Dr. Woodworth. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yeah, so before we get into it, just want to say this was a really nice book. I thought it was very touching in certain moments. I thought it was great that they put together this work in honor of James Bud Robertson. But so before we really get into any aspect of this book, let's just first talk about James Robertson, or otherwise, I think most people probably know him as Bud Robertson
All right.
when they talk about him. So if you just want to address who he was, or if you just want to talk a little bit about his career.
Okay. Well, so Bud Robertson was one of the great Civil War historians of the 20th century. He was a Virginian, and he taught for many years, and he's best known as being for many years a professor at Virginia Polytechnic Institute, or Virginia Tech. And he was sort of became a legend, a fixture there. He did a lot of other interesting things in his day. He did serve as an NCAA football referee, interestingly enough, before I knew him. That was in his past already then. And he was on I think it's the President's Commission on the Centennial of the Civil War. That's, way back there, and from 61 to 65. And kind of the years when, like, 61 was the year I was born. He was already, on the President's Committee on the Centennial of the Civil War, and I'm like a baby. And of course, he didn't know me then. So anyway, I didn't know him then either. But anyway, so he was on that committee, and I think President Kennedy appointed him to it. And of course, that kind of leads us. Then there are, I should say here, there are a couple of the essays in the book that actually are kind of reminiscences of Bud. So we had, and then maybe you wanted to ask about this later, but as long as I'm talking about Bud, we'll talk about the book is kind of about the Civil War, yeah, and then with a couple of chapters about Bud. So there is a chapter in there about how Bud in 1963, a terrible weekend when John F. Kennedy was shot, and they contacted Bud because Jackie Kennedy wanted President Kennedy's funeral to be not totally, but very largely reminiscent of Lincoln's funeral. So, they asked the Civil War guy, right? So they asked Bud, and that led to, it's a really interesting story. Bud and I think the librarian of the Library of Congress or something like that, and going around with flashlights in the basement of the Library of Congress in the middle of the night, because they've got to hurry, they got to get this going, and it worked out well. So anyway, but he's best known, like I say, as a professor at Virginia Tech, and he had a Civil War symposium that they would have there every year, and I was invited to it twice. I know a lot of the guys did better, but I was relatively obscure. And so anyway, it was really nice of Bud to have me in. He was just a real gentleman, really kindly, really nice guy. And you didn't always have to agree with him. He was just a really decent human being and a great scholar, and very much appreciated him.
The story about him taking part in John F. Kennedy's funeral was fascinating. I had never heard that story before. And when it was brought up later in the book, when there was another historian that told him, you should write about this, you should write an article about this, he declined. He never did. He would tell
Mhm.
people about it if they asked, but it didn't seem like he ever wanted to really make that a public item. I'm just curious as to why you think that might be.
Why? Yeah. Well, he certainly never told me why he felt that way. I imagine that, it's a tragedy that Kennedy's death. Obviously, it's a very sad thing, and just don't want to be known for that. The guy that planned Kennedy's funeral, um, I suppose, just didn't like to talk about it. It's a sad thing. Didn't want to talk about it. That's the best I can guess.
Even in the light of all that, it always seemed that he had a great sense of humor. One of the essays actually really talks about
Mhm.
that humor, I think, a little bit.
So, right. David Sneed wrote the essay that talked about the funeral.
Hmm.
And then Jack Davis, who was a colleague of or William C. Davis, is it says on his books, but his friends call him Jack. And call him Jack, he's still around. Jack Davis was a colleague of Bud there at Virginia Tech for a number of years. And he wrote just a lot of, sort of happy reminiscences of being friends with Bud.
There's one particular story in there that made me laugh. I thought it was very funny. But I really recommend if you pick up this book. Now, one of the big key items that Bud Robertson was known for was, and most Civil War historians know him for his biography on Stonewall Jackson. And that's even, I would argue, even within these essays, he actually is a key character within some of these essays. For people who only know him as the author, really the author of this definitive biography of Stonewall Jackson, what part of his legacy do they often overlook in terms of his overall career?
Okay, of Bud's legacy.
Yes, yeah.
Well, he was very versatile. He wasn't just a one-dimensional scholar, just the Jackson guy. Yes, he did write as far as I'm concerned, the best biography of Stonewall Jackson. It's big, it's definitive, it's interesting, it's a great book. Um, but that wasn't all that Bud did. And so he wrote a biography of Ambrose Powell Hill. He edited Longstreet's memoir, From Manassas to Appomattox. And there's an edited edition of that. Bud was the editor, and quite a youthful Bud Robertson. My old copy goes way back, and there on the dust jacket, there's a picture of Bud looking quite youthful. Um, what else? Just well, actually, when we as the so I had who are we actually? So I had two co-editors on this project. They're both professors at Liberty University. There's Chris Smith and Chris Jones. No, those are their real names, honestly. Really good guys, wonderful Christian gentlemen. And so we talked about like what should we, what kind of essays should we solicit people to write on this. And well, let's try to further things that Bud did, areas of history that he wrote into. And we started thinking about, okay, what did Bud write? Well, he wrote on generals, leaders. He wrote on battles. He wrote on uh, common soldiers, and he wrote on the home front. So pretty much everything. So we just said, well, we're just going to take essays, on leaders, common soldiers, and the home front, which is what we have in the book, along with the two essays that are more reminiscences of Bud, and a short essay by Bud's widow, interestingly enough, Betty. We were very privileged to be able to put that in there too. So, yeah, he's very versatile, all-around scholar, and just a true gentleman and a scholar. Uh,
Was there a particular lesson or something that Robertson did that really shaped your own career?
hmm. That's a good question. I don't know if I'd say shape my career, but help me along and encourage me. And you appreciate the people that encouraged you along the way. I'm getting old enough in life to think back, through life, and there have been a number of older people who kind of people who were ahead of me on the road of life and kind of gave me a hand up, and I appreciate that. Um, Bud was like that, just a kindly gentleman. Oh, by the way, on the Jackson thing, and maybe you were planning to ask about this later, but I just can't let this go. Um, Actually, one of the essays in the book that I'm most happy about is by um, my co-editor, Chris Jones. Chris was a student at Virginia Tech. Now, he didn't get his doctorate with Bud because Virginia Tech didn't offer doctorates, didn't give doctorates. It only, the highest degree it gave was a master of arts. So Chris got his master's degree under Bud. Bud was his advisor for his master's degree, and Chris was Bud's um, graduate assistant. That's the people that do the stuff, so that we professors don't actually have to do all this stuff. It's nice. Graduate assistants are great. I remember one professor I had who said that, that ever since slavery had been abolished, we had to adopt the thing of having graduate assistants. That sounds terrible. That doesn't sound good at all. But anyway, that was one of my professors way back in the day, and that was not Bud. But anyway, Chris worked for Bud while Bud was writing the Stonewall Jackson book. So he was, that was the era that he was there. And I remember Bud saying once that he traveled like nonstop for 2 years researching the Jackson book. And he said it was like Christmas every day. And if you've done research in archival sources, where you go to a manuscript repository and they bring out the cart full of all those boxes that you've requested with the different collections of letters. Oh yeah, it is like Christmas every day. And you pull out a letter and look at it. Yeah. So, and of course, Bud, when he came through Fort Worth from time to time, I remember him telling the story of how he found, actually an archivist found it and showed it to him. Stonewall Jackson's little book of like I don't know, moral precepts or precepts of getting along in society. Anyway, and that was really cool. But I wondered, while Bud was traveling around for 2 years and it was Christmas every day, doing all that archival research stuff, like, how do you get a 2 year sabbatical? I suppose if you're Bud Robertson, you do get a 2 year sabbatical, maybe. But Chris tells me that while Bud was doing a lot of traveling, Chris was actually teaching his courses there. So he's the guy that, taught Bud Robertson's courses while Bud was researching the Jackson book. And anyway, Chris and Bud were really good friends. And late in his life, Bud told Chris, um, I think we've had it wrong about Stonewall Jackson's cause of death. I thought he got shot. No, well, he did. Yes, of course he did. Everybody knows that. But the point is, then what took his life? So he's got shot in the army. His arm was amputated. We all know he's taken to Guinea Station. And he was getting better until he wasn't. And then he went downhill and he died. And we all have thought that he died of pneumonia. And that's what Bud wrote in his biography of Jackson. Like I say, best biography of Jackson there is. You're not going to find a better one than that. But Bud told Chris, he said, I put in a biography that he died of pneumonia, and I'm not thinking that's true anymore. I think there was another cause of death. And so Bud and Chris discussed it, and I think it was sepsis, which, a lot of guys in the Civil War did die from sepsis. If you had, a wound, that blood poisoning, basically, that's what often would take your life. It could be pneumonia, it could be sepsis or gangrene or whatever. In this case, sepsis. So Bud told Chris, you should write the article on that because, that needs to be told. And so Chris finally did, and it's in the book. And like I say, it's one of the chapters I'm most excited about because what we wanted to do, the main thing we wanted to do in that book, Chris and I, what we wanted to do was basically be like, the famous dwarves standing on the shoulders of giants. or a giant. And Bud was the giant. And we wanted to, pick up the, the baton, as it were, and carry it farther. And that chapter about the death of Stonewall Jackson, that was the chapter that like most obviously and directly did that. It picked up the research that Bud had done, and then he even gave, Chris the tip, really need to look into this. And so Chris makes the case. Stonewall Jackson died of sepsis.
Well, and it sounds like when he did get wounded, that it wasn't the only mistake that the soldiers made at the time, because when they were carrying him off, they dropped him. Um,
Right.
and that only made things worse.
Yeah.
But yeah, I didn't know any of that. That all of that was completely new information to me,
And
and I I think Chris did a phenomenal job of writing that. So,
sure. Yeah. Hmm.
all right. So moving on, you you actually decided to write your own essay as well in this book,
Hmm. Hmm.
and I thought it was very fitting that you wrote about the Fifth Texas. But I have to ask, why did you specifically decide to write about the Fifth Texas and why its Second Bull Run?
Okay. Well, thereby hangs a tale. Here's, let's see. Old professors get long-winded sometimes, so let me try to. Uh, here's what happened. It goes back a long ways. Um, an editor at a press that I was working with suggested to me, you know what you ought to do? You ought to write a book about two individual soldiers who kind of meet on the same battlefield, not maybe face on, just directly kill each other or something like that, but just they got to the same battle, one Union, one Confederate. The problem with that was that, if you have enough to write about any one soldier, it's going to be because you had his letters or diary. And once you have that, you're so dependent on that one source, the letters or diary, that what you have is really, a paraphrase of his letters or diary, and then who wants to see that? But I thought, what you could do, yeah, this all is part of the answer to that chapter. What you could do, thought I, was what if you wrote on two companies? Because, as you know, the company is really the fundamental building block unit of the Civil War armies. A company is usually recruited from one town or locality, and the guys know each other and so forth. So, yeah, I'll take two companies. So, what two companies? Well, I cast about, and were quite a few companies that could have been picked, and I decided to pick a company from a New York regiment, actually a company from the 44th New York. If you think 44th New York, where have we heard that name? Well, if you've been to Gettysburg, remember the Castle Tower on Little Round Top? 44th New York. So a company from that regiment, and then I'll take a company from a regiment that met them on Little Round Top. And so, hey, how about the 5th Texas? Yeah. And so this is just a little off topic, but it does get to that chapter. So I'll write on the 5th Texas too. Well, what company should I write on in the 5th Texas? And I remembered I had visited a town in Texas, down kind of towards Houston, northwest of Houston, uh, Independence, Texas. That was kind of an interesting town. Had supposedly the oldest Baptist church in Texas. Now I don't know if I really believe that, but it's an old one, that's for sure. And originally Baylor University was there, but it's a good town anyway. And then there was a company I, the 5th Texas, was recruited from there. Now we get the 5th Texas, right? So I researched those two companies, and I wrote up a manuscript. I sent it off to the publisher, and you know how this goes. Sometimes the scholarly readers said, you need to do a lot of, and for your listeners, let me just say that when you write one of these books, you send the manuscript to a publisher, and they send it off to run through a gauntlet of scholarly readers. And it's always helpful. Some scholarly readers are just helpful, just really helpful. And some scholarly readers are helpful and a pain in the neck. And we won't say which one I had for this one, but they wanted a lot done on it. So I kind of set that manuscript aside to kind of think about it for a while. Like, do I want to do as much as they want me to do, or do I want to do something else with that manuscript? Just kind of set it aside. Yes, even guys who have had a book or two published, we've had, some that the ones that got away. So I set that manuscript off to the side, and I had some other things to work on. Actually, I wanted to give more time to a manuscript I was working on, Ulysses Grant, which has successfully run the gauntlet of the scholarly readers at another press and should be appearing between two covers next year. So that's great. But that book about the company from the 5th Texas and the company from the 44th New York that met on Little Round Top, and actually I came across a source of a sergeant in the 44th New York capturing some prisoners from the 5th Texas. So they really did meet. But anyway, I had set that aside. So now we come to this project, the And Rest Under the Shade, what we want to call And Rest Under the Shade of the Trees. And what shall I write on? You know what? I have a chapter in that book on the 5th Texas at Second Manassas. I have, in that manuscript, it's unpublished, it's kind of sitting around, actually not literally gathering dust, it's an electronic file. But I've got, the whole history of the 5th Texas from the time they're organized till the time that they get to Gettysburg and their fight at Gettysburg. And then I've got that company of the 44th New York. So, Company E of the 44th. And so, hey, it's never been published before. So I will just use that chapter on Second Manassas. So why Second Manassas? Well, of course, I've got, like I say, all the battles of the 5th Texas. But Second Manassas was really the 5th Texas biggest battle before Gettysburg. This was their most intense battle. Hood's brigade really played an important role at Second Manassas. So yeah, this is an idea too. So that's how I started. I wound up writing a chapter on the 5th Texas at Second Manassas.
Kind of a winding road to that, I suppose.
It is sometimes a very winding road,
Yeah.
and that's something for younger scholars to remember. I mean, there are setbacks sometimes, like, I thought that manuscript would go through, but it didn't, and I haven't given up on it yet. I'm still thinking about what I'm going to do with it, the whole thing, I mean. And then, there are parts of it that can be used for other purposes too. So, yeah.
Another one of these essays that I really thoroughly enjoyed all of them, but again, one that really stood out to me was Brian Steele Willis's
Hmm.
his essay,
Yeah.
and I might butcher this name, but he wrote an account about Nassau County, Virginia.
Hmm.
If I'm saying that correctly?
That's as good as I could have said it.
Okay. He entitled it "Let Us All Suffer Together," which I actually thought that was a great title
Hmm.
for something like this. This was one of the essays that talked a lot about the home front and what the people in Virginia experienced at this time.
Hmm.
And it sounds like it was a very, very difficult time, and I could only imagine how Bud Robertson would even interpret this particular account because he was known as Mr. Virginia.
Hmm.
And so I'm just curious as to um, what this just briefly explain what this chapter was about, and maybe if you talk to Brian Steele Willis, why did he take the time to write about this?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. So, right, Bud is kind of Mr. Virginia. Uh, Brian actually grew up in Nansemond County. That's his home where he was from, and so that's where his kind of Civil War journey started. And studying about the Civil War. So for him, it was kind of like going back and studying about his home country. That's interesting because I think of Brian so much with his biography of Nathan Bedford Forrest, which is we've been talking about Bud writing the best biography of Stonewall Jackson. I think Brian wrote the best biography of Nathan Bedford Forrest. And Brian did such a good job with that. And of course, he's written various other articles and chapters on Forrest. And then I've been, I've heard Brian give his talk on Forrest a few times too, because sometimes at different symposia, we'd both be on the program. And so I'd give my lecture about whatever, and Brian would give his lecture about Forrest. And he does that so well. I mean, you almost, can believe that Brian is Nathan Bedford Forrest, that it's kind of a shock to remember that, hey, wait, he's not from West Tennessee or North Mississippi. He's actually from Nansemond County, Virginia. So I thought he did a great job of really, kind of getting at what it would have been like to live there. To me, with history, that's one of the things that always fascinates me. What would it have been like to be there and to be part of that and to experience that another time and place? And Brian did a great job of bringing that out. It's not, a home front essay is not going to be like, say, an essay on Stonewall Jackson's death. He gets wounded, they carry him off, he dies. There are many things in it, and it's not the same kind of drama story. It has a drama all its own of just understanding what it would have been like to live in Southeast Virginia during the Civil War.
The thing that I really liked about it is he really took several personal accounts about it and really described them in quite a bit of detail, and that the war, it's not always just as simple as good and bad. There's a lot of in between, and I think he did just a great job of kind of
Mhm.
explaining and interpreting all that.
Yeah.
And another more uh, interesting piece. One of the essays was by Emery Thomas,
Yeah.
and he wrote the essay "Make the Confederacy Great Again." And this particular title, when I first read it, I actually figured there'd be a lot of greater undertones to it.
Hmm.
But as it turned out, within the very first paragraph of this essay, he immediately condemns the
Mm.
actions of Dylan Roof and of slavery. So then, how is it that he makes this argument that we should interpret the Confederacy again?
Well, yeah, the title was a bit shocking to me too. I contacted Emery and didn't want to contribute an essay to this. He said, "Yeah, I've got an essay I'd like to, contribute, and it's this one." And so, you know, almost anybody else, if the title had been "Make the Confederacy Great Again," I would have said, wow, maybe for somebody else's book, wow, that just sounds kind of shocking. But I knew that Emery was not, he wasn't one of those people who dress like mattresses, sheets, Um, he's, I knew he was squared away on that. So, I found the essay interesting. I found it very thought-provoking. Um, and just, how we should understand the Confederacy, what it does mean, and what we should learn from it going forward.
And earlier, you mentioned that one of the other contributors of the book was Bud Robertson's widow,
Yeah.
and she had a very nice piece. And by the way, I think it was perfectly placed right at the end of the book. What was this? What's the significance of having her write a piece within the greater part of this book?
Mhm. Well, it is a book in honor of Bud, and I think that she, well, obviously, is better placed than any of the rest of us who knew him. We all knew him, in his professional capacity, but she knew him as a husband for many years, and I think, as far as an understanding of him and who he was as a person, uh, and she was the one to do that. And I was so pleased that she agreed to write that essay. She she was good friends with Chris Jones, he was Bud's grad student, and he knew Betty, and he said, I think Betty might be willing to write an essay for this book, and uh, I don't know, she may have felt some reluctance, but I think she kind of wanted to, but she wasn't sure that she could write it well enough. She writes plenty well enough. She does fine, and I think it was you feel like you read it and just feel like you appreciate Bud a little more and know know him as a person a little more.
Well, and I feel like it really reminds the reader too that he's a lot more than just a historian, and that he published all these books, but he has his family, he has a side of him that
Mm.
I think he would probably appreciate almost more than him just being a historian.
Oh yes.
And we talked about earlier about how Chris Jones was a former student
Mm.
of Bud Robertson, and he was a teacher, he was a professor for I don't know
Is
how many years.
or Chris,
Um, Bud.
but oh yes, right. Oh,
Um,
it's long time.
I'm curious, did Chris Jones ever go into or talk about how, or describe Robertson as a teacher simply than a historian?
Not too much. I think uh I think he would say that Bud was, very his lectures were very similar to the lectures he gave at his symposia, and uh an excellent storyteller of the Civil War, someone who could really draw you in to his lectures. But Chris and I haven't really discussed Bud as a teacher a lot, other than Chris had huge respect for him, and sounded very interesting. And I think I'd say that his lectures to his classes were not so different from his lectures to his symposium. Obviously, different content because you got to cover the whole war when you teach it.
Sure. Well, Robertson spent decades making Civil War history accessible to the public.
Hmm.
And he, as you already said, he talked about a variety of different subjects. It wasn't solely focused on Jackson or solely focused on a battle or something like that. So, in your own opinion, do you think that modern historians have actually become too specialized?
Ooh, that's a good question. That's a good question. Personally, in my own pilgrimage academically, I wanted to resist specialization. There was so much that was interesting in history, and I didn't want to get, shoved into too small of a niche in it. So should historians be less specialized? Oh, that is difficult. I think there's something to be said for it. Um, Now, I start to think of a number of historians, and um, I think that they are probably broader in their coverage than what the public might think. For example, people might think about Bud and think, oh, the Stonewall Jackson guy. And like I said, he's a lot more than that. And I think of Brian Wills, oh, the Nathan Bedford Forrest guy. But Brian does a lot more than that. But that's maybe not as well known. We tend to publish in the areas that we are most specialized in. But, I think where you see professors uh, being broader and more versatile is in the classroom. I had the uh, privilege, we haven't done a volume of essays in honor of, but I don't know if we will. Publishers, by the way, nowadays, publishers are not so sure about volumes of essays. They don't like volumes of essays. People don't want to read volumes of essays. I didn't know that, but supposedly that's the case. Um, but yeah, but my old undergraduate mentor, John Y. Simon, editor of the Grant Papers. And again, people think of Simon as the Grant guy. And he edited the Grant Papers and did a wonderful job. It was a wonderful work of scholarship. But in the classroom, he was very versatile and just had a tremendous knowledge of the Civil War. I think that's what you would find. So I think you'll find they're they're more versatile in the classroom, but there's a tendency to publish you know where the sources are, you know all the nuances of it, and to write a book like Bud, his Jackson book, you have to know so much about Jackson and about everyone who touched his life, and there's such a depth of knowledge there that that's kind of got to be pretty specialized.
Yeah. What do you think Bud would say about the current state of Civil War scholarship itself?
Oh, well. Now, Civil War scholarship. Well,
If feel free, by the way, if this is not a question that you want to answer, that's fine. I'll just edit this part out.
well, we'll see.
Okay.
So you may want to edit out some parts of it.
Sure.
So I can picture Bud. Let's say that he were here, and we asked that question to him. Sometimes Bud could be fluently silent in six languages. I mean, not literally, but he like about the Kennedy funeral. He didn't like to talk about that. Um, there were some things going on in the world of Civil War history that Bud didn't necessarily like, and some things were. Interestingly enough, there are some things going on in American history that I don't necessarily like myself. But for Bud and me, these were not always the same things. One of the great things about Bud is that he was a gentleman and a scholar, and he didn't think that everybody needed to agree with him all the time. I'm afraid I was very much more of a Yankee than that. Well, I know I was very much more of a Yankee than Bud. Bud wasn't a Yankee at all, um, but I was, and I think, for example, Bud and I had very different opinions of the movie Gods and Generals. Now, Bud, see, was very much involved in the writing of or in the making of Gods and Generals. He was their chief historical consultant. And you could see and that movie, of course, dealt with Jackson a lot. And when Gods and Generals, the movie, dealt with Jackson, and when it wanted to be accurate, it could be very accurate. The whole scene of Jackson's wounding, and he's being carried out on the litter, and one of the litter bearers gets shot by more friendly fire, and etc. Very accurate. And a lot of else about Jackson was accurate. A lot of the dialogue in Gods and Generals is like word for word. Someone wrote down that they said that. Um, I think that's one of the things, by the way, that made it difficult for Gods and Generals, because we don't talk that way anymore. So I think it's hard for an actor in the modern day to deliver lines the way they would have delivered. And I don't know how they would have delivered them. It's just that when you hear the actor say the lines that were said, and someone wrote it down, he said this, and the actor delivers those lines, and you feel like somehow I'm this great actor, but I'm not sure that that's really how it sounded from that person. I don't know how it did sound, but I just have a hunch it sounded different. So anyway, so Bud, okay, so get back to the question. Bud was not a fan of statue removal. Now this is somewhere I would have differed with Bud a little bit. I think there are some statues probably need to be taken down in an orderly way. I'll give an example of how it should be done. The University of Texas had a big statue, well, it was a life-size statue of Jefferson Davis on campus on a big pedestal. It's a 15-foot pedestal, and there's Jeff Davis up there. And it was there for many, many years. Obviously, it was put up in the days when people put up things like that. Now it's time to take down. So what Texas did, UT did, is they took the statue off the pedestal and they put it in their campus history museum and archive. It's called the Bristow Center. And so if you want to do like archival research, manuscript research at UT, the Bristow Center is where you go, Briscoe Center. And so they've got some museum displays there, and one of them is the Jeff Davis statue. And now you can stand right next to it, like not, whoops, there it is up on that pedestal, but no, kind of measure yourself height-wise against it. The real Jeff Davis was about my height. This guy, Davis, the statue might be like an inch or two taller than life size. And then there's also an exhibit there with videos of movies and stuff about like what were people thinking when they put this up, and why was it put up, and what did it mean, and what was the sound like then, and why did we take it down, and so forth. So you're not destroying history, you're not destroying a work of art, and you're not having a riot or something like that, but it's being done in a good way. You know, I I never heard Bud talk about the Davis statue at UT. Now, I don't think he liked having the statues taken down in Richmond, on Monument Avenue.
Mhm.
Um, Lee and Jackson, he wasn't for that at all. Somewhat mixed feelings myself, but yeah.
Now, I watched a video of Bud years ago. I think he was talking about his book on Robert E. Lee.
Mhm.
He was asked a question about uh, Confederate statuary,
Mhm.
and he had a very unique perspective of that. And I didn't know what to think of it at the time, honestly, because I'd never heard this answer before, but it just kind of goes to show Bud's um, mind a little bit. Well, he personally recommended, he said, what they need is actually a statue of Lee, not on a horse, not in his military uniform, but they need a statue of him in civilian clothing,
Mhm.
and not on a pedestal or anything like that. And that's to represent the educator
Yes.
that Lee became.
Mhm.
And I thought that answer was very interesting because I genuinely at the time I was like, I don't know. I mean, I'd never considered that before.
Yeah. Well, I didn't know that Bud had said that. That's interesting that because I never heard him say that, and I don't doubt that he did. And because I've been going around saying that myself. We say, oh, Lee was, for reconciliation after the war. That could be exaggerated, I think. Um, Ask Ty Sedgley about that one. Um, but uh, you know, Lee, this statue is for Lee, the uniter, the reconciliation guy, the educator, the helping uh, develop character of young men, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, yeah, but he's on a horse in a uniform. That's not about Lee the educator. That's Lee the general, and yeah, he was. Well, durst I say this? Yeah, I'll say it. I'm with. Oh, okay. I'll just say I'm with Ty Sedgley on Lee. Maybe I would be a little. Uh, I'm assuming you know who Ty Sedgley is.
I
He's
do.
wrote Robert E. Lee and Me, and a former head of the history department at West Point. And I think maybe Ty had to express himself a little more forcefully because of his background being what it was. He growing up in Lee country and Alexandria and so forth, and other places where Lee was kind of worshipped. Whereas I grew up in the land of Lincoln, and um, so I'm a big Lincoln fan, and I don't apologize for that at all. But anyway, I think he's right about Lee and what Lee did in the war and all. But hey, if you want to celebrate Lee, yeah, let's build a statue of Lee as an educator in civilian clothes, on foot, as the students would have seen him maybe walking around the campus of Washington College then.
Yeah, and I don't know what the answer would then be for Confederates that did not survive the war, I
Yeah.
suppose. Um,
Hmm.
but again, that's something that people are going to have
You
to
know,
decide on their own.
Yeah. There's a little town about 20, 30 minutes from here. Actually, since they built the bypass over the railroad crossing down at Crescent, it's about 20 minutes from here, called Granbury. And guess who that's named after? Brigadier General Hiram Granbury, uh, commander of the Western Texas Brigade, the Texas Brigade of the Army of Tennessee. And there on the courthouse square is a statue of Hiram Granbury. it may not be one of the best works of art I've ever seen, but okay, it's supposed to represent Hiram Granbury. Should they take down the Granbury statue there? Well, the town's named after him. Can we change the name of the town? Maybe, I guess if you want to. Something like that. What I would say is, if the people of Granbury want to leave the statue up, I'd let them leave it up. Uh, and if they want to do that, I let them do that. Why? Well, he wasn't very high in rank. He was a brigadier general. Now, yeah, he did fight for the cause of treason. Yes, that is true. And for the cause of slavery, and that's neither one is good. But yeah, it's been a long time. And if their town's named after him, yeah, he fought bravely for treason and slavery. So yeah, I'll leave the statue up. There's some statues that, so just if you ask me about statues, I'd say there's some statues that I'd say they need to stay up. So Lincoln statue, yeah, it's staying up. But we don't like Lincoln in this town. Tough. He's a national hero. He should stay up. George Washington, uh, his statue up. Now, I'd say it should stay up. Yeah. The locals say, oh, we don't like George Washington. Take a statue. No, 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 no. Sorry. He should stay up there. There's some statues that should come down. I don't care if the locals want to keep it or not. I'll give you an example of the monument. It wasn't a statue, actually, but the monument to the Ku Klux Klan in New Orleans. It was just taken down within the last, 10 or 20 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, that needed to come down. Absolutely. Statues of guys like Lee. Yeah, Jefferson Davis for sure. Jefferson Davis statues need to come down. Yeah. Guys like Lee, he was pretty senior. He was pretty high in rank in what he did and in his treason. And, uh, he had taken an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States. And he'd gone back and he'd participated in insurrection. And the 14th Amendment was written for people like Lee, possibly even for some modern people that the Supreme Court thinks it doesn't apply to, but that's another story. Anyway, so I would lean towards taking down statues of high-ranking people like that. I would tend to say let the local people decide. I guess if there's a town and they've got a statue of Lee and they want to leave it up, I won't say I like it being there. Lee on a horse, Lee as a traitor. I won't say that I necessarily like seeing it up there, but I don't want it to be taken down. And another word about statues, I don't know if this is how, if your blog audience is interested. I have never seen a riot that I liked. I have disapproved of every riot in this country since the Stamp Act crisis. I disapproved of those two. I wasn't alive then. I know I'm pretty old, but I'm in a But I disapproved of the Stamp Act riots and every riot since then. Now here's a Civil War story. You may know this one. You know, okay, it's just it's a good story. It makes a good point, and it illustrates what I think about riots. Okay, back in 1859, 1860, the state of Wisconsin was coming into almost conflict with the federal government because the federal government was enforcing the fugitive slave law, and the people of Wisconsin were resisting it. And it seems as crazy as it seems, potentially, if the southern states could have held off in seceding, the way this case between Wisconsin and the federal government was going, conceivably, there could have been fighting between Wisconsin and the federal government. There could have been a different revolt, and it would have been Wisconsin revolting against the federal government against slavery. I guess I would have to make an exception to my disapproval of rebels in that case. Well, there was an individual in Wisconsin at that time. He wasn't at the heart of this. It's dealt with in the case of Abelman versus Booth, which went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, Wisconsin Supreme Court, you can't block the fugitive slave like that, act like that. And basically, the Wisconsin Supreme Court says to the U.S. Supreme Court, oh yeah, watch us. We will anyway. Well, this guy wasn't Abelman and he wasn't Booth. He was a Norwegian American in Milwaukee. His name was Hans Haig. Ring a bell? Yeah, you're gonna that name. Well, if you've been to Chickamauga Battlefield, he was there. But during the Abelman versus Booth controversy, Hans Haig, Norwegian American, raised a company. This sounds familiar, Civil War, like, this is like 1860. He raised a company of his fellow Norwegian Americans to fight for Wisconsin against slavery. Well, it never came to fighting, so they didn't go to war. But of course, then a few months later, the southern states seceded, and then there's a war. So Hans Haig leads his company of Norwegian Americans, to go and now fight for the United States against slavery. And that company became part of the 15th Wisconsin. Eventually, Haig became colonel of the 15th Wisconsin. And then by September of 1863, Haig was the senior colonel of the 4 regiments in his brigade. And since his brigade didn't have a brigadier general appointed for it, it was often the case in the Union armies, Haig, senior colonel, took over command of the brigade. He was commanding that brigade at the Battle of Chickamauga when, fighting down in Vineyard Field, southern end of the battlefield there, Haig was fatally wounded and bravely and heroically leading his troops to stop the Confederate attack there, Hood's attack there on the south end of the battlefield. And so Haig died there. And on the Chickamauga battlefield, there's no statue of Haig. There's just the typical thing that we see on Chickamauga battlefield. Any place where could be a general or even a colonel commanding a brigade fell. There is a monument in the form of a pyramid of cannonballs. I think it was like 8-inch cannonballs or something, and they make a pyramid of them. And some of those monuments have sadly been vandalized. But anyway, that's all there is there at Chickamauga in Vineyard Field, marking where Haig died. But the state of Wisconsin commissioned an equestrian statue of Hans Haig, as he looked, probably there in Vineyard Field in his last battle, on horseback, waving his sword, bravely leading his men on. And that picture of Hans Haig, that statue of Hans Haig, was put up on the grounds of the state capitol there in Madison. Beautiful town, beautiful Capitol building. History education at that university may need some help. Because during the Black Lives Matter riots of, a few years ago, there was a riot there in Madison, and the rioters pulled down the statue of Hans Haig. Why did they do that? This guy is an abolitionist. He's ready to go out and fight against slavery for the state of Wisconsin, against the United States. I think it was this belief that any statue of a Civil War person is must be some kind of racist rebel. So they pulled down his statue. I hope it's been put back up since then. But anyway, that's kind of a pet peeve of mine. Like Hans Haig, and pull down a statue. I don't believe in riots. That's not the way to pull down statues. And you know what? Even if a statue, I think in North Carolina there was some statue of a Confederate soldier, like a generic Confederate soldier, got pulled down by a riot. I don't believe in that. Even if a statue needs to come down, it shouldn't be pulled down in a riot. It needs to be done in an orderly and lawful way.
I never heard about Hans Haig.
Really?
Really,
Well, that's
I learned something.
your Civil
Um,
War for today.
yes, good. Uh, well, as we wrap up this conversation, there's one last question that I do have, which if you could ask Bud Robertson one final question about the Civil War today, any
Mm,
question you wanted, what would
what?
that be?
Um, hmm. I might ask him. Okay. I can't resist this one. I don't know if I really would. It's like only one question. I want more. I want more. But what would have happened if Stonewall Jackson had been at Gettysburg? I might have asked him what he thought about that. Your favorite indoor sport of Civil War historians. What would have happened if Stonewall Jackson would have been at Gettysburg? Well, I don't know. He'd been dead for 2 months, so I don't see what he would have been able to do. But I wonder what Bud would have said about that, or you know, I, how would he compare, say, Jackson? What Jackson's performance, say, to Ewell at Second Winchester, big win for the rebels there in that campaign. Comparing Jackson to Ewell, I'd love to hear what he had to say about that. Um, I guess one of those would be my. I probably couldn't resist. Um, but I'd say that would have to be a joke question. I'd have to get another question to come back seriously. Compare Ewell and Jackson.
No, I like the first question. Because I mean, hey, he might know the answer to that one. I mean, if there was anyone that should write an article on that piece, probably Bud.
Right.
Well,
Yeah. If there's
um,
anyone that's going to give Jackson his due or better, it would be Bud. He
yeah,
loved Jackson.
yeah. Well, again, we are here with Dr. Steven Woodworth, editor of "And Rest Under the Shade of Trees: Essays in Honor of James Robertson Jr." You can buy it on Amazon or at Laurel Hill Publishing. And remember, if you need a fix for history, go check out History Fix, where you can stream videos about George Washington, Dwight Eisenhower, or really any other historical figure that you so wish. So sign up today, start your trial now. I am the dramatic historian, and have a wonderful Saturday.